The President of the United States walked his niece down the aisle to marry her own cousin. It was a Saturday afternoon in March 1905 in a townhouse on East 76th Street in Manhattan. The bride was 20 years old. The President was 46. The groom was 23. The bride and the groom were related to each other. The bride and the President were related to each other. The groom and the President were related to each other. The wedding was, by every measure, a family event. The bride's name was Eleanor. She had grown up an orphan. Her father had been an alcoholic, and he had drunk himself to death in a sanatorium when she was 9 years old. Her mother had died of diphtheria a year before that. She had been raised by her grandmother in a house in New York, in a family that had decided very early that she was a problem to be managed. She had been told for most of her childhood that she was plain. She had not expected, by the time she was 20, to be standing in a wedding dress at all. The President's name was Theodore Roosevelt. He was the most famous man in America. He had charged up a hill in Cuba 7 years before, had become president after the previous one was assassinated, had won the office in his own right the previous November. He was the bride's uncle, her father's brother. He had taken an afternoon off from running the country to give his niece away because there was no one else to do it. Her father was dead. He had loved his brother, even at the end, and he loved his brother's daughter. He walked her down the aisle. The groom's name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a quiet young man with thick glasses, an only child, raised at a country estate on the Hudson River by an overbearing mother. He had just graduated from Harvard. He had no career yet. He was 23 years old. He was the bride's fifth cousin. A fifth cousin is the great-great-great-grandchild of someone you share a great-great-great-grandparent with. The Roosevelts had been marrying their own cousins for so many generations that the family tree had grown into a thicket. Franklin would become President of the United States 28 years later. He would win 4 elections. He would lead the country through the Great Depression and through the Second World War. He would die in office in 1945, after 12 years in the White House, longer than any man before him or any man since. His wife Eleanor, the woman in the wedding dress, would become the most influential First Lady the country has ever produced. 3 presidents of the United States, 2 generations of one family, 1 photograph from a Saturday afternoon in 1905. The newspapers of the day covered the wedding as a society event. They described the bride's dress in detail. They listed the menu at the reception. They named some of the guests. They did not find anything strange about a sitting president walking his niece down the aisle to marry her own cousin. Nobody at the wedding found it strange. Nobody in the family found it strange. The Roosevelts had been marrying themselves for 200 years. There were 2 branches of them, the Hyde Park Roosevelts and the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. They lived an hour apart in New York. They considered each other neighbors. They went to the same schools. They summered at the same compounds. They knew each other's children's names. The 1905 wedding was a family event in the most literal sense the English language has ever managed. Widen the photograph. The guests are visible. There are dozens of them. There are Astors in the room. The Astors had been the richest family in America since 1848. When John Jacob Astor died with a fortune larger than the federal budget of the United States. There are Livingstons in the room. The Livingstons had given the oath of office to George Washington at his first inauguration in 1789, in New York, in a building that no longer stands. There are Schermerhorns in the room, and Van Rensselaers, names from before the country was a country, families that had owned the land under New York City, when New York City was still called New Amsterdam, and the British had not yet taken it from the Dutch. The wedding photograph from East 76th Street, if you know how to read it, is a picture of the people who would run the United States of America for the next 40 years.
Most of them are related to each other. Many of them are also related to the people who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Some
of them are related to the people who are running the country tonight. This is a film about those families. Not one family, not two. The same small group of intermarried American houses that has held the presidency, the cabinet, the Senate, the Treasury, the central banks, and the most powerful offices in the most powerful country on earth for 250 years. The United States was founded in a fight against the rule of kings. The men who wrote the founding documents promised the world that the new republic would never grow an aristocracy of birth. There would be no inherited class. There would be no inherited power. Anyone could rise. The son of a farmer could become president. The promise was broken almost as soon as it was made. It was broken by the men who made it. By the time the sixth president of the United States took the oath, only 28 years after the country was born, the office had already passed from a father to his son. John Adams was the second president. John Quincy Adams, his son, was the sixth. The founders saw it happening. They wrote about it in their old age. In their final letters to each other, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson sat in their farmhouses in Massachusetts and Virginia and argued about whether the country they had built was already an aristocracy in disguise. They concluded that it was. They wrote it down. They were ignored. 200 years later, the country is still being run by 12 families across 46 presidencies, held together by the same prep schools, the same secret societies, the same family banks, and 250 years of intermarriage. To see how it happened, you have to go back further than the Roosevelt Wedding, further than the country itself, to the houses on the Virginia Tobacco Coast, 3 generations before the Declaration was signed, in a colony where a few dozen households had been marrying each other for 100 years. The aristocracy America fought a revolution to escape did not arrive after the founding. It was the founding. It is still the country. The Virginia Tobacco Coast in the year 1700 was a strip of land about 200 miles long, lying between the Potomac River in the north and the James River in the south. It was not yet a state. It was not yet part of a country. It was a colony of the British Empire, settled by English families who had crossed the Atlantic in the 1600s, brought enslaved Africans with them in growing numbers, and built large plantations on the rich soil along the rivers, where ships from London could sail directly up to the wharves to load tobacco for the English market. The families who owned these plantations ran the colony. They held the seats in the House of Burgesses. They controlled the courts. They owned the land, the tobacco, the ships, and the people who worked the tobacco. There were not very many of them. A few dozen households at any given moment in the 18th century. A small, closed class, marrying each other for 100 years, holding the wealth and the politics of a stretch of land that would one day produce 4 of the first 5 presidents of the United States. The names of these families would have been familiar to anyone in colonial Virginia. Washington, Madison, Jefferson, Monroe, Randolph, Lee, Harrison, Carter, Byrd, Custis, Page, Pendleton, Mason, Henry, Wythe. They sat next to each other in the colonial legislature, stood as godfathers to each other's children, and inherited each other's land when their cousins died without sons. When the Revolution came, it was these families who led it. George Washington was 11 years old when his father died in 1743. His older half-brother Lawrence, 25 and recently returned from a war in the Caribbean, married a 15-year-old neighbor named Anne Fairfax that same year. The Fairfax family were the land agents for Thomas, 6th Baron of Cameron, who owned the entire northern neck of Virginia by royal grant. 5 million acres, a holding larger than several European countries. Through Lawrence's marriage to Anne, The orphan boy who would become George Washington had been brought, by family, into the most powerful estate in the colony. That marriage set the course of his life. The Fairfaxes gave him his first job as a surveyor on the Virginia frontier, sent him on his first military command, and brought him into a circle of Virginia gentlemen who would, 20 years later, pick him to lead the Continental Army. He later called his time at the Fairfax estate of Belvoir the happiest moments of my life. When Washington married, at the age of 26, he married a wealthy widow named Martha Dandridge Custis. Martha had been widowed at 25 after her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, died, leaving her one of the richest women in Virginia. She brought to the marriage several plantations, hundreds of enslaved people, and 2 young children from her first marriage. Those children were named John Parke Custis and Martha Parke Custis. They were 4 and 6 years old when their mother married the future first president in 1759. Keep those names in mind. They will come back. When George Washington took the oath as the first president of the United States in 1789, the network of Virginia families that had raised him was not left behind in the new country. It was the new country. The third president, Thomas Jefferson, was born in 1743. His mother was a Randolph. The Randolph family was so large, so intermarried, and so wealthy that historians of colonial Virginia sometimes just called the 18th century planter class the Randolph Network. Through his mother, Jefferson was a cousin in some degree to nearly every major planter family in the colony, including the Lees and the Marshalls. The fourth president, James Madison, was born in 1751. His father's cousin married into the Taylor family, who would later produce the 12th president, Zachary Taylor. James Madison's wife, Dolly, would marry her sister Lucy off to a man named George Steptoe Washington, the first president's nephew. The fifth president, James Monroe, was born in 1758 in Westmoreland County, on the northern neck of Virginia. Westmoreland County had also produced George Washington, half a century earlier. The two estates were a few hours' ride apart. The ninth president, William Henry Harrison, was born in 1773 at Berkeley Plantation on the James River. His father was Benjamin Harrison V, who had signed the Declaration of Independence. His grandfather was Benjamin Harrison IV. His great-grandfather was Benjamin Harrison III. His great-great-grandfather was Benjamin Harrison II. The Harrisons had been in Virginia since the 1630s. The historians of colonial Virginia have a name for what this network was. They call it the Tidewater Aristocracy. It was not a metaphor. It was a closed class, held together by marriage, by slavery, by land, and by control of the colony. It produced, in a single generation, the men who would write the Declaration of Independence, lead the Continental Army, draft the Constitution, and hold the first 5 presidencies of the United States. The colonial aristocracy led the Revolution. The Revolution did not abolish the aristocracy. It promoted it. George Washington died at Mount Vernon in December 1799. He left no biological children. His estate passed, in part, to the grandchildren of his stepson John Parke Custis, the boy of 4 who had come into Washington's household in 1759. John Parke Custis died young in 1781 during the Revolutionary War. His children were raised, in part, by their step-grandfather. One of those children, George Washington Parke Custis, would build a house overlooking the Potomac River on a hill across the water from the city named after his step-grandfather. He called the house Arlington. He had a daughter. Her name was Mary. Mary Anna Randolph Custis was born on October 1st, 1807, at Arlington House. She was the step-great-granddaughter of George Washington. Her father had spent his life collecting Washington's possessions, and the house she grew up in was a private museum of the founding generation. Washington's papers were in the study. His silver was in the dining room. His military tents from the Revolutionary War, the actual canvas marquees he had slept in at Valley Forge, were stored in the attic. In 1831, Mary married a young Army lieutenant who had grown up nearby. His name was Robert Edward Lee. His father, Light Horse Harry Lee, had been one of George Washington's cavalry commanders during the Revolution. His mother was Anne Hill Carter, of the Carter family, the same Carters who had married into the Harrisons and the Randolphs. Through his mother's line, Robert E. Lee was a cousin of the Harrisons. Through his marriage to Mary Custis, he became the step-great-grandson-in-law of George Washington. When he and Mary moved into Arlington House, the country that George Washington had built was 42 years old. The man who would lead the war to break it apart was eating dinner off Washington's plates. 30 years later, in April 1861, that country broke apart. The southern states were leaving the Union. South Carolina had seceded in December 1860. 6 more states had followed by February 1861. Confederate forces had fired on Fort Sumter on April 12th. President Lincoln had called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. On April 17th, Virginia voted to secede. The day before Virginia seceded, Francis Preston Blair, acting on Lincoln's authority, offered Robert E. Lee command of the Federal forces. Lee was 54 years old. He had served the United States Army for 30 years. He had graduated second in his class at West Point, fought in the Mexican War, run the academy. He was thought to be the finest officer in the country. Winfield Scott, the head of the Army, had told Lincoln that Lee was the man to lead the war against the South. Lee said no. He could not, he said, draw his sword against Virginia. On April 20th, he wrote 2 letters from Arlington House. The first was a single-sentence resignation addressed to the Secretary of War. The second was longer, to Scott, his old commander and friend. 2 days later, he took command of the military forces of the state of Virginia. Within a year, he would be leading the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. He would lead it for 4 years against the country his step-great-grandfather-in-law had built, in a war that would kill approximately 750,000 Americans. His wife Mary, by then confined to a wheelchair by rheumatoid arthritis, stayed at Arlington for another month. On May 15, 1861, she finally left to go live with cousins in Virginia. She gave the keys to the house to her enslaved housekeeper, a woman named Selina Gray, and asked her to look after it. Union forces took Arlington within days. When soldiers began stealing items from the house, Martha Washington's china among them, Selina Gray walked to the office of General Irvin McDowell and told him what was happening. She said the items in the house had belonged to George Washington, and they were not the soldiers to take. McDowell listened. He shipped the most important Washington pieces to the United States Patent Office in Washington for safekeeping, where they were later moved to the Smithsonian. The federal government did not return them to the Lee family until 1901, almost 40 years later, when President William McKinley signed an order to give them back. Robert E. Lee never lived at Arlington again. The federal government seized the property in 1864 and began burying Union dead in the gardens to make sure the Lees could never return. The estate is today the Arlington National Cemetery. The man who led the war to break the United States of America apart had grown up inside the household of the man who built it. The aristocracy of Virginia produced the founders, the early presidents, and the Confederate commander. The Revolution had not abolished the aristocracy. The Revolution had been led by it. That is the first 5 families in this account. The Washingtons. The Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe line of the Virginia Republicans. The Harrisons of Berkeley Plantation. The Tylers of Sherwood Forest. The Lees of Stratford Hall. 5 families across a single colony, intermarried for 100 years before the country existed, who produced 4 of the first 5 presidents of the United States, and the man who led the war to break it apart 80 years later. 5 down, 7 to go. The 6th family came from outside Virginia. They came from a town outside Boston called Quincy. They produced the first president to take the oath from outside the Tidewater, and 28 years later, the first president in American history to inherit the office from his father. The man doing the warning was the same man whose son took the oath. The aristocracy had not been left behind in Europe. It had been brought across the Atlantic and given a new flag. On February 9, 1825, the United States House of Representatives met in Washington to pick the 6th President of the United States. The vote had been thrown to the House because none of the 4 candidates in the previous autumn's election had won a majority of the Electoral College. Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, a Carolina backwoodsman who had been orphaned at 14 and scarred across the face by a British officer's sword, had won the popular vote with 152,901 ballots. He had also won the electoral count with 99 votes. He was the choice of the country by every available measure. He needed 131 electoral votes to take the office outright, and he had 99. The Constitution required the House to pick. There were 3 names on the House ballot: Jackson, John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, who had finished 2nd, William Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury, who had finished 3rd, Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, had finished 4th and had been knocked off the ballot. Clay was also the man who would count the votes. He spent the weeks before the ballot meeting privately with state delegations. He told his supporters to vote for Adams. On the morning of February 9th, the House voted. Adams won 13 states. Jackson won 7. Crawford won 4. The man who had finished 2nd in both the popular and the electoral count became the 6th President of the United States. 3 weeks later, Adams gave Henry Clay the job of Secretary of State. Jackson resigned his Senate seat. He told his supporters that the election had been stolen. He began running immediately for 1828. His supporters had a name for what had happened in the House on February 9th. They called it the corrupt bargain. They were not wrong. They had won the election, and the offices of the new republic had taken it from them. The man the offices had given the seat to was the son of the 2nd President of the United States. John Adams, the father, was 89 years old that winter. He was alive. He was at home in Quincy, Massachusetts, in a small farmhouse outside Boston, in the same county where he had been born and where his father had farmed. He read the newspaper accounts of his son's election when the mail arrived from Washington, weeks after the vote. He had not been to the Capitol in 24 years. He had spent those 24 years writing letters. In the autumn of 1814, an old Virginia politician named John Taylor of Caroline had sent him a book attacking, by name, an older book Adams himself had written about constitutional government. Adams was 79 years old. He read the book and answered. He wrote a series of long letters across the spring, summer, and winter, arguing with the Virginian about democracy, aristocracy, and what the country was becoming. In a letter dated December 17, 1814, he wrote, "There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." The argument he was making across those letters was harder than the famous line. He was telling Taylor that the country they had built was not really a democracy at all. It was a representative government, which meant a few men cast votes that counted for many. He called what they had built by its actual name. He called it aristocracy. The men running the country, he wrote, had been picked by each other. They had grown up in the same households, married into each other's families, sent their sons to the same schools,
and made sure those sons took their father's seats. He was writing this from his farmhouse at the age of 79. His own son had been Secretary of State of the United States since 1817. John Quincy Adams was 47 years old when his father began the letters to Taylor. He had been a diplomat since the age of 14, when his father had taken him to Europe to work as a secretary at the American legations in Paris and Amsterdam during the Revolutionary War. He had gone to Harvard. He had served as ambassador to the Netherlands, then to Prussia, then to Russia, then to Britain. He had married Louisa Catherine Johnson, the daughter of an American merchant in London. He had been a United States Senator from Massachusetts. By the spring his father was writing to Taylor, he was 3 years away from taking the State Department under James Monroe, the 5th president from Virginia. 4 of the first 6 men to hold the presidency would reach the office through that one department. The father warning, from Massachusetts, about the artificial aristocracy that had taken the country was raising the next member of it in his own household. While Adams was writing to Taylor in 1814, he was also writing to Thomas Jefferson. The letters with Jefferson had begun 2 years earlier, on January 1, 1812, after 12 years of silence between them. The 2 men had not spoken since the election of 1800, in which Jefferson had defeated Adams for the presidency in a campaign so vicious that Adams had left Washington the night before Jefferson's inauguration rather than attend it.
They had been allies in 1776 and enemies by 1800. A Philadelphia physician named Benjamin Rush brought them back together. Rush had signed the Declaration of Independence alongside both of them. He had spent the years after their falling out writing letters to each of them about the other. He told Adams in 1809 about a dream he had once had, in which the 2 old men shook hands and made peace. He kept telling him. He told Jefferson the same thing. In January 1812, Adams finally wrote. The exchange that followed would run to 158 letters across 14 years. Benjamin Rush, the man who had made it happen, died in 1813. He saw 4 letters of his work, and no more. What Adams was telling Jefferson in those letters, and what he was telling Taylor in his letters at the same time, and what he could not yet tell his own son, was that the country they had built was already gone. The aristocracy had taken it. The aristocracy was now passing itself through the State Department. The aristocracy was about to pass itself through his own household in the next presidential election after the one currently being argued in his correspondence. The election came in 1824. His son became the 6th President of the United States in a House vote arranged by the Speaker of the House. The first president elected from outside the Virginia network was succeeded by his own son. The transfer happened against the popular vote, against the electoral vote, against the candidate who had won the most ballots cast in both. It happened in the House of Representatives, with the help of the Speaker, who took the State Department as his payment. The father had warned from a farmhouse in Quincy about the artificial aristocracy that would take the Republic. His son became its first non-Virginian president through a deal that proved every warning the father had ever written. John Adams was 89 years old. He read the news in the Boston newspapers 3 weeks after the vote, in the same farmhouse where he had been writing letters for the past 24 years. He had 2 years left to live. That is the 6th family in this account, the Adamses of Quincy. The first family to put a son in the presidency after his father, 28 years after the country was born. The dynastic principle did not creep into American politics across centuries. It started in the first generation, in the household of the only president who had come from outside the planter class. 6 down, 6 to go. The 7th family did not come from a farmhouse in Massachusetts. They came from a saloon in East Boston, run by an Irish immigrant whose grandson would set out, with money and ruthlessness and a documented plan, to put 3 of his own sons in the United States Senate and one in the White House. He had not stopped the aristocracy. He had only delayed it long enough to die first. On a Sunday afternoon in August 1944, two Catholic priests arrived at a large stone house on the south shore of Cape Cod and rang the doorbell. The man who answered was 55 years old. He had been the United States ambassador to Great Britain. He had been the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He had made a personal fortune on Wall Street large enough to support 9 children for the rest of their lives. His name was Joseph Patrick Kennedy. The priests had come to tell him his eldest son was dead. Joseph Kennedy Jr., a 29-year-old Navy lieutenant, had been killed the previous evening over the Suffolk countryside in England. The aircraft he was flying had exploded mid-air on a top-secret mission codenamed Operation Aphrodite. The aircraft had been packed with 12 tons of high explosive. The pilot in the observation plane behind him reported that nothing larger than a basketball survived the blast. There were no remains to bring home. The father listened. He thanked the priests. He went back into the house. He told his wife Rose and the children who were home. Then he went upstairs to his study, closed the door, and put a record on the gramophone. He had been training his eldest son to become the first Catholic president of the United States. By the time he came back downstairs, he had already begun training the second. Joseph Patrick Kennedy had been born in East Boston in 1888, the son of an Irish saloon keeper and ward boss named Patrick Joseph Kennedy, who had served 4 terms in the Massachusetts state legislature. He went to Boston Latin and then to Harvard. By the age of 25, he was running a bank in East Boston. By 1929, he had taken a fortune out of Wall Street, using methods that, after the crash that October, would become illegal under the laws he himself would later be brought in to write. In 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt named him the first chairman of the new Securities and Exchange Commission, the federal agency built to police Wall Street. When a colleague asked the president why he had picked such a notorious market manipulator to police the market, Roosevelt is said to have answered, "Takes one to catch one." Kennedy spent 15 months at the SEC, wrote the disclosure rules that still govern American corporate finance, and quit. Roosevelt sent him to the new Maritime Commission. Then, in 1938, Roosevelt sent him to London as the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom, the first Irish Catholic to hold that office, in the country that had ruled Ireland for 700 years. The ambassadorship ended his political career. Kennedy was an isolationist. He believed that Britain could not survive the German air war that began in 1940. He told American reporters that democracy was finished in England. The interview was printed. Roosevelt quietly pushed him out. Kennedy came home to the United States in late 1940 and never held federal office again. He turned his attention to his sons. Joe Jr., the eldest, had been the chosen heir from childhood. He was a delegate to the 1940 Democratic National Convention. He intended to run for the House of Representatives after the war as his first step toward the presidency. The family had known, for as long as the children could remember, that he would be the first Catholic president of the United States. He had told his friends so himself. His death in August 1944 ended that plan. The second son was John. He had served in the Navy in the South Pacific. He had won a medal for rescuing his men after his patrol boat was rammed in half by a Japanese destroyer in 1943. He had come home with chronic back pain that would shadow him for the rest of his life. By 1944, he was 27 years old and had been planning to become a journalist. His father had other ideas. John Kennedy was elected to the United States House of Representatives from Massachusetts in 1946, 2 years after his older brother's death. He was elected to the United States Senate in 1952, beating the incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., a member of one of the oldest political families in Massachusetts. By 1957, he was openly preparing to run for the presidency. The 1960 campaign was the project the father had been building for 30 years. The decisive moment came on May 10, 1960, in the West Virginia presidential primary. West Virginia was a Protestant state where only about 5% of voters were Catholic, and the question on the ballot was whether a Catholic candidate could win in a state that did not contain many Catholic voters. Kennedy was up against Hubert Humphrey, a senator from Minnesota with almost no money. The Kennedy family had a great deal of money. The Kennedy campaign handed payments to local political leaders for placement on the slate cards that told voters how to vote. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Jr., the son of the late president, mailed 50,000 letters into West Virginia under his own signature, postmarked from Hyde Park. Kennedy won 60.8% of the vote to Humphrey's 39.2%. Humphrey withdrew that evening. Kennedy was nominated at the Democratic Convention in July. He beat Richard Nixon in November by one of the narrowest margins in American electoral history. On January 20th, 1961, he was sworn in as the 35th President of the United States, the youngest man ever elected to the office. His father, 68 years old, was in the front row. The new president gave his brother Robert the job of Attorney General. Robert was 35 years old. The third brother, Ted, was 29. He won the Massachusetts Senate seat his oldest brother had given up when he won the White House. He would hold it for 47 years. Joseph Patrick Kennedy had a stroke in December 1961, 11 months after his son's inauguration. He lost the use of one side of his body and the ability to speak any word other than no. He lived for the next 7 years in a wheelchair at the house on Cape Cod, where the priests had once come to the door. He was alive when his son John was killed in Dallas on November 22, 1963. He was alive when his second son Robert was killed in a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles on June 5, 1968, in the middle of his own presidential campaign. Joseph Patrick Kennedy died at the house on Cape Cod on November 18, 1969, at the age of 81. He had outlived 4 of his 9 children. The family did not stop. Ted Kennedy served in the United States Senate for 47 years, from 1962 until his death in 2009. John's daughter Caroline served as the United States ambassador to Japan, then to Australia. Robert's son, Joseph Kennedy III, served in the United States House of Representatives. Patrick Kennedy, Ted's son, served in the House. Robert's son, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., was sworn in as the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services on February 13, 2025. 64 years after his uncle John had taken the oath of office for the presidency in the same city. On the wall of the house at Hyannisport, where Joseph Patrick Kennedy spent the last 7 years of his life, unable to speak any word other than no, there are photographs of all 9 children. 4 of them died before he did. That is the 7th family in this account. The Kennedys of Hyannisport. Joseph Kennedy had spent his life trying to break into the American aristocracy that had locked his father out of Boston. He had broken in. His grandson sat in the Cabinet of the United States in 2025. The Irish saloon keeper's grandsons had not torn the aristocracy down. They had joined it. The United States tells the world it is a democracy. It tells its own children that no aristocracy of birth has ever taken root in the Republic, that any boy from any town can grow up to be president. This film has now shown 7 families across 2.5 centuries that prove the story is not true. The Washingtons. the Jefferson-Madison-Monroe line, the Harrisons, the Tylers, the Lees, the Adamses, the Kennedys. The same aristocracy holding the same office by a different mechanism each time. Inheritance, marriage, the State Department, the Senate, the bullet, the foundation, the cabinet. Always the same office, always the same aristocracy. 5 families still to come. The next did not need to build their way in, or marry their way in, or inherit their way in. The schools, the bank, and the secret society had been making presidents on their own schedule for over 100 years. On a spring night in 1916, a 21-year-old Yale junior named Prescott Bush walked from his dormitory to a windowless brownstone on High Street in New Haven, Connecticut, knocked 3 times on a heavy wooden door, and was led into the building. The building had no windows. It had no sign. It had no listed function on any city tax record. Local residents called it the Tomb. It had been built in 1856 for a Yale student society called Skull and Bones, which had been founded 24 years earlier in 1832 by 2 members of the Yale class of 1833. One of the founders was a man named Alphonso Taft. Alphonso Taft would later serve as the United States Secretary of War and the United States Attorney General. His son, William Howard Taft, would become the 27th President of the United States and the 10th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only man in American history to hold both offices. William Howard Taft was also, in his junior year at Yale, walked to the same building on High Street and let in. The society took in 15 new members each spring. They were called Knights. The night Prescott Bush was let in 1916, he became one of 15 young men who would carry the same membership for the rest of their lives into the boardrooms of New York banks, the State Department, the United States Senate, the founding board of the Central Intelligence Agency, and eventually, the presidency of the United States. Prescott Bush's son, George Herbert Walker Bush, would walk to the same building 31 years later in 1947 and be let in by the same ceremony. He would become the 41st President of the United States. Prescott Bush's grandson, George Walker Bush, would walk to the same building 20 years after that, in 1967, and be let in by the same ceremony. He would become the 43rd President of the United States. 3 generations of one family. 3 nights at the same door. Prescott Bush had been born in 1895 in Columbus, Ohio, the son of a manufacturing executive. After Yale and an artillery captaincy in France during the First World War, he married a young woman from St. Louis named Dorothy Walker. Her father, George Herbert Walker, ran a Wall Street investment firm called W.A. Harriman & Company, founded with the money of the railroad heir E.H. Harriman. In 1931, the Harriman firm merged with another Wall Street investment bank, Brown Brothers & Company, founded in 1818 and the oldest private bank in the United States. The new firm was called Brown Brothers Harriman. Prescott Bush became one of its founding partners. He held that position for the next 40 years. In 1942, the federal government seized one of the companies on which Prescott Bush served as a director. The company was called the Union Banking Corporation. It was a New York investment bank set up in 1924 that held American assets for a German industrialist named Fritz Thyssen. Thyssen had been one of the original financial backers of the Nazi Party in the 1920s and early 1930s. He had publicly broken with Hitler in 1938 and fled Germany. By 1942, he was a prisoner in a German concentration camp. The bank that held his American assets kept running in New York. Prescott Bush was a founding director of the bank. So was E. Roland Harriman, the brother of Averell Harriman, and a fellow Yale bonesman from the same year as Bush. The bank's other directors were two more Brown Brothers Harriman partners and three associates of Thyssen. On October 20, 1942, the United States Alien Property Custodian issued Vesting Order No. 248 under the Trading with the Enemy Act. The order seized all of the bank's stock, shares, and dividends. 8 days later, the federal government seized two more companies on whose boards Prescott Bush had served. 3 weeks after that, it seized a fourth, a steel company that had run coal mines at Auschwitz through a partnership with the German chemical conglomerate IG Farben. The seizure documents are in the National Archives. No criminal charges were ever brought against the American directors. After the war ended, the assets were quietly handed back to Brown Brothers Harriman. The bank kept running. Prescott Bush kept his career. 10 years later, in 1952, he was elected to the United States Senate from Connecticut. He served for 11 years. He was a close personal friend of President Dwight Eisenhower. He played golf with Eisenhower at Augusta National. He was one of the small group of Republican senators who advised Eisenhower on cabinet picks. He was, by the time he left the Senate in 1963, one of the most well-connected men in the United States. His son, George Herbert Walker Bush, had been the youngest pilot in the United States Navy when he took his oath at the age of 18 in 1942, the same year his father's bank was seized. He flew 58 combat missions in the Pacific. His plane was shot down in September 1944, and he was picked up at sea by an American submarine. He went to Yale on the GI Bill. He was let into Skull and Bones in 1947. He moved to Texas after graduation, made a fortune in oil, served in the United States House of Representatives, served as ambassador to the United Nations, served as chairman of the Republican National Committee, served as chief of the American Liaison Office to China, served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, served as vice president of the United States for 8 years under Ronald Reagan, and was elected the 41st President of the United States in 1988. His son, George Walker Bush, was let into Skull and Bones in 1967. He moved to Texas after Yale, made a fortune in oil, became governor of Texas, and was elected the 43rd President of the United States in 2000. In the 2000 election, the result came down to the vote in a single state. The governor of that state was George W. Bush's younger brother Jeb, who had himself been at Phillips Academy Andover with the rest of the family and had been preparing for his own presidential run. The recount in Florida was halted by the United States Supreme Court in December 2000. The state was given to Bush. He was sworn in as president in January 2001. In the 2004 election, Bush was challenged for re-election by Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts. Kerry had been let into Skull and Bones in 1965, 2 years before Bush. Both men had taken the same oath in the same building on the same night of 2 different years. When the journalist Tim Russert asked each of them about the society on national television during the campaign, both men gave variations of the same answer. They said it was secret. They said they were not allowed to talk about it. The election was decided by a margin of about 3 percentage points. 2 members of the same Yale secret society ran against each other for the presidency of the United States. One of them won. 3 generations of Yale. 3 generations of Skull and Bones. 2 presidents, 1 vice president, 1 senator, 1 governor, and a network so deep that 2 members of the same 15-person per-class society ran against each other in 2004 for the presidency of the United States, and the country treated it as a normal election. The story America tells about itself is that any boy from any town can grow up to be president. The Bushes are what that story was always hiding. 3 generations through the same prep school at 14, the same university at 18, the same secret society at 21, and the same family bank at 30. That is 8 families now, across 2.5 centuries, holding the same office through the same aristocracy. Aristocracies do not tolerate outsiders. They never have, in any country, in any century. America's aristocracy is no different. The few men who reached the presidency from outside it found out how ruthless an aristocracy can be with people who do not belong. On January 30th, 1835, a cold, misty Friday, the 7th President of the United States walked out of a congressional funeral at the Capitol building in Washington and came toward the East Portico to leave for the White House. He was 67 years old. He was getting over bronchitis. He was leaning on a walking cane. His name was Andrew Jackson. An unemployed house painter named Richard Lawrence stepped out from behind one of the pillars of the East Portico, pulled a single-shot flintlock pistol from inside his coat, aimed at the president's heart from a distance of less than 10 feet, and pulled the trigger. The percussion cap fired with a loud crack. The powder failed to catch. The bullet stayed in the barrel. Jackson raised the walking cane and rushed at him. Before Jackson reached him, Lawrence pulled a second flintlock pistol from another pocket, aimed at the president's chest from point-blank range, and pulled the trigger. The cap fired. The powder again failed to catch. The second bullet also stayed in the barrel. Bystanders tackled Lawrence to the floor of the East Portico. A young Tennessee congressman named Davy Crockett was reportedly among them. The president was led away, unharmed. The 2 pistols were later looked at by federal investigators and found to be properly loaded. A century after the attack, the Smithsonian Institution ran tests on both weapons. Both fired without difficulty on the first try. A contemporary arms expert calculated the odds of 2 flintlock pistols, properly loaded, both misfiring at point-blank range as roughly 1 in 125,000. This was the first attempt on a sitting United States president in the country's history. It happened to the first president who had reached the office from outside the network the previous 6 men had built. Andrew Jackson had been born in 1767 in a log cabin on the Carolina frontier, the son of an Irish immigrant who had died before he was born. He was orphaned at 14 by a smallpox epidemic that took his mother and both of his brothers. He had been scarred across the face by a British officer's sword in the Revolutionary War when he was 13 years old and a prisoner of the Crown. He had no Harvard. He had no plantation. He had no cousins in the House of Burgesses. He hated the Eastern banking class with a personal intensity that survives in his letters. In 1832, 3 years into his first term as president, he had vetoed the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, the federal financial institution that the Tidewater aristocracy and its successors had used to control American credit since the founding. His veto message stays one of the most quoted documents in American political history. He told Congress that the rich and powerful too often bent the axe of government to their own ends, and that the federal government should not be a partner in that bending. 3 years after the veto, 2 pistols misfired on the Capitol steps. The pattern that began with Jackson did not end with him. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the first president from outside both the Tidewater and the New England networks, the son of an illiterate Kentucky farmer, was shot in the head at Ford's Theater in Washington by an actor named John Wilkes Booth. Earlier that afternoon, Lincoln had told his bodyguard, a man named William Crook, that he believed there were men who wanted to take his life. He had no doubt they would do it. He walked into the theater that evening with the conversation still in his head. He died the next morning. On the morning of July 2nd, 1881, James Garfield, the 20th president, a former classics professor from Ohio who had been nominated for the office on the 36th ballot at a contested Republican convention the summer before, was shot in the back at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington by a disappointed office seeker named Charles Guiteau. The wound itself was survivable. The president's doctors probed it for the bullet with unwashed fingers for 10 weeks, bringing on infection that spread through his stomach. Garfield died on September 19th. On the afternoon of September 6, 1901, William McKinley, the 25th president, a former Ohio congressman who had beaten the populist William Jennings Bryan in 2 presidential elections in a row by promising the gold standard and the protective tariff, was shot in the chest at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo by a Polish-American anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. McKinley died on September 14th. The vice president who took his place was a 42-year-old reformer from the New York Roosevelt family named Theodore. By the end of the 19th century, 3 United States presidents had been killed in office. All 3 had reached the presidency from outside the network the founding families had built. No president from the Adams, Roosevelt, or Virginia lines had ever been shot. The pattern carried into the 20th century. On November 22, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th president, the son of Joseph Patrick Kennedy, and the product of the project this film has already documented, was shot in the head from the 6th-floor window of a textbook warehouse in Dallas as his motorcade passed through Dealey Plaza. He died within the hour. He had been in office for 34 months. He had spent much of that time fighting with the agencies he had been elected to lead. He had fired the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Allen Dulles, after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion the year before. He had told a reporter, in a conversation widely repeated afterward, that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. He never got to. His brother Robert, who had served as his attorney general and who was running for president himself, was shot in a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles on June 5, 1968, by a young Palestinian immigrant named Sirhan Sirhan. Robert Kennedy died the next morning. 2 brothers from the same family, the only members of the family ever to seek the presidency of the time, were both shot within 5 years of each other. On March 30, 1981, Ronald Reagan, the 40th president, a former Hollywood film actor and governor of California, who had reached the Republican nomination over the objections of the party's Eastern establishment after twice losing it in earlier years, was shot in the chest outside the Washington Hilton by a 25-year-old named John Hinckley Jr. 3 other men were wounded in the same shooting. Reagan was rushed into emergency surgery and survived. His press secretary, James Brady, was shot in the head and partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. That was the last attempt against a sitting United States president for 43 years. On the evening of July 13, 2024, a 20-year-old gunman named Thomas Matthew Crooks climbed onto the roof of a building roughly 447 feet from a campaign stage at the Butler Farm Show in Butler, Pennsylvania, where the former president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, was speaking to a crowd of supporters about immigration. Crooks took aim with a semi-automatic rifle. He fired 8 rounds. At the moment the first round reached the stage, Trump had turned his head roughly 1 inch to the right to look at a chart on a screen showing border crossing numbers. The bullet that would have gone through his right temple grazed the upper part of his right ear instead. A second bullet hit a 50-year-old firefighter named Corey Comparator, who had thrown himself in front of his wife and daughters when the shooting began. Comparator died at the time scene. 2 other rally attendees were critically wounded. A Secret Service counter-sniper found Crooks on the rooftop within seconds and killed him with a single shot. Trump dropped to the floor of the stage. The Secret Service shielded him with their bodies. When they rose to walk him from the stage, he raised his fist in the air, blood streaking down the right side of his face, and shouted the word "fight" 3 times into the microphone before being led away. The chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, opening a hearing on the attack 10 days later, said that a bullet which would have pierced the president's skull had instead grazed his right ear, because at exactly the right moment, the president had turned his head to read a chart. 2 months later, on the afternoon of September 15, 2024, a 58-year-old man named Ryan Wesley Ruth set himself up with a rifle in the bushes along the perimeter of the Trump International Golf Club in West Palm Beach, Florida, where Donald Trump was playing the 5th hole. A Secret Service agent walking ahead of the president saw the rifle barrel sticking out from the foliage and opened fire. Ruth ran. He was arrested on the highway 20 minutes later. Trump won the November election. He was sworn in as the 47th President of the United States on January 20th, 2025. The list is now 7. Andrew Jackson, 1835. Abraham Lincoln, 1865. James Garfield, 1881. William McKinley, 1901. John F. Kennedy, 1963. Ronald Reagan, 1981. Donald Trump, 2024. Of the 46 men who have held the office of President of the United States, fewer than 10 reached it from outside the founding families and the institutions they built. Of those, everyone was shot at while in office or on his way to it. The men who came from inside the network: the Adams family, the Harrison family, the Roosevelt family, the Bush family, the long line of Virginia planters and their heirs, almost all died of old age in their beds. The flintlock pistols Richard Lawrence used on the Capitol steps in 1835 are in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution today. The bullet that grazed Donald Trump's ear in Butler in 2024 was photographed in mid-flight by a photographer for the New York Times. The photograph has been printed in newspapers in every country on earth. 189 years, 7 men. The pattern was not coincidence. The story America tells about itself is that violence against presidents is a tragedy that strikes at random. The evidence is that violence against presidents strikes only one kind of man: the outsider. The man who reached the office without belonging to the families that built the country. The founders warned us that an aristocracy of birth and wealth would always defend itself. They did not say how. The 7 men on this list show how. The aristocracy did not die after the founders. It did not weaken after the killings. It got stronger. And it is still running the country today. Not from the White House, though. From the rooms next to it. And it is more scandalous than you think. One last piece of evidence is all that remains.
By the time Bill Clinton left the White House in January 2001, the post-presidency of the United States had become the most lucrative phase of a political career. In the 13 years after he left office, the former president gave roughly 545 paid speeches around the world. The Washington Post added up his total income from those speeches at roughly $105 million. The largest single fee was paid by a Russian investment bank in 2010, the year his wife Hillary became Secretary of State. The bank paid him $500,000 for one speech in Moscow. The Clintons had come from outside the network. Bill Clinton was the son of a traveling salesman who had died in a car accident before he was born. He had been raised in Hope, Arkansas, by a stepfather who beat his mother. He had reached the presidency through Georgetown, a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, Yale Law, and the governorship of Arkansas. He had no Tidewater, no Roosevelt cousinage, no skull and bones. He had not been shot at. When he left the office, he did not retire. He did the opposite. He set up a foundation, joined the global lecture circuit, courted the donors who had funded his campaigns, and began traveling the world as a private citizen with the prestige of a former head of state. By the end of his first decade out of office, he was earning more in a single year of speaking fees than he had earned in his entire 8 years as president. This was new in American politics. It was also not new in the history of the families. The Rockefeller family had been running the same move for 100 years. David Rockefeller was born in 1915, the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, and the wealthiest man in American history at the time of his death. David never held elected office. He died in 2017 at the age of 101. In between, he ran Chase Manhattan Bank for
12 years as chairman and chief executive. He chaired the Council on Foreign Relations, the private policy group that shapes American foreign policy across administrations of both parties, for 15 years. He founded the Trilateral Commission, the international policy body that brings together heads of state, central bankers, and corporate executives from North America, Europe, and Japan in 1973. His brother Nelson Rockefeller served as governor of New York for 15 years. Nelson ran for the Republican presidential nomination 4 separate times, in 1960, in 1964, in 1968, and again briefly in 1976. He never won it. In 1974, he was named Vice President of the United States by Gerald Ford, who had himself been named Vice President the year before. Nelson Rockefeller served as Vice President for 2 years, the only man in American history to hold the office without ever being elected to a national seat. The Rockefellers never produced a president. They did not need to. Every Treasury Secretary of both parties from the 1970s through the 2000s, under Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Bush again, was personally connected to David Rockefeller, to Chase Manhattan, to the Council on Foreign Relations he chaired, or to the small set of New York investment banks the family had built in the previous century. The Cabot Lodges of Massachusetts had been running the same move for longer. Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. was a United States Senator from Massachusetts for 31 years, from 1893 until his death in 1924. In November 1919, he led the Senate fight against the Treaty of Versailles, the document that would have brought the United States into the League of Nations. Lodge killed the treaty. The United States never joined the League. The international order Woodrow Wilson had built his presidency around died on the Senate floor at the hands of a man who had never been president and never would be. His grandson Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. was also a United States Senator from Massachusetts. In 1952, he lost his seat to a 35-year-old Navy veteran from Boston named John F. Kennedy. He went on to serve as Richard Nixon's running mate in the 1960 presidential election, the one Kennedy won. He then served as the American ambassador to South Vietnam during the most important years of the war, under both John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, the two presidents who escalated American involvement in Southeast Asia. The Cabot Lodges produced no president. They were never shot at. They held a Senate seat or a major diplomatic post in every generation from the 1890s to the 1980s. When Bill Clinton left office in 2001, he found a model already built. He learned it quickly. He took the speeches. He set up the foundation. He courted the donors who had funded his campaigns and the corporate executives who had paid to attend his administration's fundraisers. He built, in the years after his presidency, an unusual public friendship with his Republican predecessor George H.W. Bush, the man he had beaten for the office in 1992. The two former presidents traveled together to the Indian Ocean tsunami zone in 2005 and to Haiti after the earthquake of 2010. They raised money jointly. They appeared on stages together. They were photographed together so often that the press took to calling them George and Bill. Bush, in interviews near the end of his life, called Clinton his son from another mother.
When George H.W. Bush died in November 2018, at the age of 94, Bill Clinton was one of the speakers at his funeral at the Washington National Cathedral. In the front pew sat the surviving former presidents of the United States, Jimmy Carter, the Clintons, the Obamas, Donald Trump, sitting then in his first term. George W. Bush stood at the lectern and gave the eulogy for his father. In the cathedral his family had attended for decades, surrounded by the men who had run against each other for the highest office in the country, and now sat in a single row of pews together. The presidency had become one credential among several. The real continuity lived elsewhere. It lived in the foundations. It lived in the speaking circuit. It lived in the board seats of the family banks and in the chairmanships of the policy councils. It lived in the next generation of the family, who had grown up knowing the other family's children, gone to the same schools, attended the same weddings, sat on the same boards. The families had stopped
running for office. They had not stopped running the country. That is 12 families across 2.5 centuries. The Washingtons, the Jefferson-Madison-Monroe line, the Harrisons, the Tylers, the Lees, the Adamses, the Roosevelts, the Kennedys, the Bushes, the Clintons, the Rockefellers, the Cabot Lodges. The same names, the same schools, the same intermarried network, the same office passed by inheritance, by marriage, by State Department, by Senate seat, by bullet, by foundation, by cabinet, and by funeral pew. The country those families have run for 2.5 centuries is not the country the founding documents described. The boy from any town who was promised the presidency does not get the presidency. The voter who was promised a choice between two parties is choosing between two wings of the same household. The soldier who dies for the country is not dying for the country the school book describes. He is dying for the network. The wealth the country produces, in every generation, ends up in the same houses. The wars the country fights, in every generation, are fought by the children of people who are not in those houses. The presidency the country votes on, in every generation, has already been narrowed to a list the network approves of. This is the cost of an aristocracy that calls itself a democracy. The cost is paid by everyone who is not in the 12. And the country is now 250 years old. The aristocracy has had 2.5 centuries to dig in. It controls the offices, the money, the wars, the schools, and the next generation of its own children. There is no version of this story where a citizen on their own walks into the network and breaks it. But the country was not always meant to end this way. 2 men saw all of this coming before it happened. They had signed the Declaration of Independence. They had served as the second and the third presidents of the United States. They had spent the last 14 years of their lives writing to each other about what the country was becoming. They did not stop at warning the country. They also wrote down what the country could do to survive what was coming. The country has read the warnings. It has never read the rest. Let us end this story by listening to what they said. In the spring of 1826, 2 men in their 80s prepared to die. One lived on a hilltop in central Virginia, in a house he had designed himself, surrounded by a private library of 6,000 books that he had recently sold to the federal government for $48,000 to settle his debts. His name was Thomas Jefferson. The other lived in a small farmhouse in Quincy, Massachusetts, in the same county where he had been born, on land he had inherited from his father. His name was John Adams. The 2 men had not seen each other in 27 years. They had not been in the same room since March 1801, when Adams had quietly left Washington the night before Jefferson's inauguration as the 3rd president of the United States, refusing to attend the ceremony of the man who had beaten him for the office. For 12 years after that night, they had not spoken or written. They had been the closest of friends through the Revolution and through their first joint diplomatic mission to Europe in the 1780s. Then the election of 1800 had broken them. The friendship had ended. In January 1812, after a Philadelphia physician named Benjamin Rush spent years writing letters to each of them about the other, John Adams sent the first letter. The exchange that followed ran for 14 years and reached 158 letters between them. They wrote to each other about the Revolution, about their wives, about the books they were reading, about religion and Greek philosophy and the French Revolution. They wrote to each other over and over and at length about what the country they had built was becoming. In October 1813, Jefferson wrote to Adams about the question he could not stop coming back to. "There is a natural aristocracy among men," he wrote. The grounds of this aristocracy were virtue and talent. It was, in Jefferson's view, the most precious gift of nature for the running of a society. He believed the American Republic had been built, in part, to lift this natural aristocracy and to keep it free of the corruptions that had ruined every previous experiment in self-government. There was also, Jefferson wrote, an artificial aristocracy founded on wealth and birth, without either virtue or talents. This second aristocracy was the one Jefferson hoped the new American institutions would hold off. The institutions had been built, in part, to keep the wealthy and well-born from turning their advantages into permanent political power. He had spent his life arguing for those institutions. Adams wrote back with his customary acid. He agreed there were two aristocracies. He disagreed about which one would win. The artificial aristocracy, Adams believed, would always beat the natural one. Men born to wealth had the leisure to put on the look of virtue and talent, which the public would take for the substance. The country he had helped found was not, in his view, going to make a republic of capable men picked by their fellow citizens on merit. It was going to make an aristocracy of birth and money that would learn, over time, how to manage the public's confidence and how to turn the offices of the new government into family property. He had written this in 1813. By 1814, he was writing the same argument to John Taylor of Caroline in Virginia, using sharper language, telling the younger man that the country was already an aristocracy in disguise, and that there had never been a democracy that did not commit suicide. He spent 12 more years writing this argument. In letters to Jefferson, in letters to Taylor, in letters to Benjamin Rush before Rush died in 1813, in letters to former colleagues, and to younger men who wrote to him asking for his views. The two former presidents argued and agreed and digressed and argued again. They were the last two surviving signers of the Declaration of Independence by the time the country came up on its 50th birthday. Jefferson wrote his last letter to Adams on March 23, 1826. Adams wrote his last letter to Jefferson on April 17th. Then both of them began to die. Jefferson took ill in late June at Monticello. By July 2nd, he had slipped into a coma. He woke briefly through the next 2 days and asked his attendants over and over whether the day was the 4th. On the morning of July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the document he had drafted in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, he was told that the day had arrived. He died around noon, in bed, in the house he had designed, at the age of 83. In Quincy, Massachusetts, 600 miles to the north, John Adams was also dying. He had been bedridden since the spring. On the morning of July 4th, he was conscious, but very weak. His family read him passages from the newspaper accounts of the Jubilee celebrations underway in Boston and Washington. He drifted in and out of sleep through the afternoon. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, he stirred briefly and spoke aloud. His family later recalled the words. "Thomas Jefferson survives," he said. He was wrong. Thomas Jefferson had been dead for 5 hours. John Adams died a few minutes after speaking. He was 90 years old. The news traveled slowly. The country woke the next morning to find out that two of its founding fathers had died together, hours apart, on the 50th anniversary of the country itself. The sitting president, John Quincy Adams, the son of one of the dead men and the former Secretary of State of the other, the man whose election in 1825 had been the first dynastic succession in American history, called the coincidence visible marks of divine favor. The newspapers printed the news in mourning borders. The country celebrated and grieved in the same week. 5 years later, on July 4, 1831, James Monroe, the fifth President of the United States and the third president to die on Independence Day, died at his daughter's home in New York City at the age of 73. 3 of the first 5 presidents of the United States had died on the 50th anniversary of the country, or shortly after, on the same date the country had been born. The country was 50 years old. The men who had built it had warned, in writing, that the aristocracy they had failed to defeat was already taking the republic. They had warned in private letters to each other. They had warned in published essays. They had warned in their final letters to younger Americans who had written to them asking for guidance. They had been right. They had also been ignored. 200 years later, the network they had warned about is still in the White House. The Adams family, the Jefferson family, the Madison family, the Harrison family, the Lee family, the Roosevelt family, the Kennedy family, the Bush family, the Clinton family, the Rockefeller family, the Cabot Lodge family. 12 families across 250 years. The same names, the same schools, the same intermarried social network that John Adams had described in 1813 as the artificial aristocracy of birth and wealth that would always beat the natural aristocracy of virtue and talent. It is the summer of 2026. The country is 250 years old. In every American town, the parades will form on the morning of July 4th. The fireworks will be lit at dusk. The speeches will be given by mayors and governors and the President of the United States. The ceremonies will repeat what they have repeated every year since the country was founded. The day will be a celebration of the documents signed on the same date 250 years before, in a hall in Philadelphia, by men who are now buried in churchyards and family plots across the original 13 colonies. Some of them died on this day. In Washington, in the buildings the founding generation laid out on a riverbank in the 1790s, the descendants of those founders will gather for the official ceremonies. Senators whose families have held office for 4 generations. Cabinet secretaries whose grandfathers sat in the same room. Foundation chairmen whose grandmothers married into the families that produced the men being honored. 12 families across 250 years. The Washingtons of the Virginia Tobacco Coast. The Adams family of Quincy. The Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe line of the Virginia Republicans. The Harrisons of Berkeley Plantation, the Lees of Stratford Hall, the Roosevelts of Hyde Park and Oyster Bay, the Kennedys of Hyannisport, the Bushes of Kennebunkport and Andover and Yale, the Clintons of Chappaqua, the Rockefellers of Pocantico Hills, the Cabot Lodges of Beverly, Massachusetts, 12 houses, 12 cemeteries, 12 front pews at 12 family churches in 12 American towns. The country was founded in a war against the rule of kings. The men who founded it promised the world that no aristocracy would ever grow in America. They wrote that promise into the documents they signed in 1776 and in 1787, and they spent the rest of their lives, in their private letters to each other, watching the aristocracy take root inside the republic they had built. 2 of them died on the same day, on the 50th anniversary of the document they had signed, having concluded in writing that the artificial aristocracy of birth and wealth had already won. The country is 200 years older now than it was when they died. The Adams letters are in the National Archives. The Jefferson letters are at the Library of Congress. The federal seizure orders against the Union Banking Corporation are on file at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The membership rolls of the Skull and Bones Society are printed in the Yale Alumni magazine 5 years after each graduating class. The minutes of the Council on Foreign Relations are kept in a townhouse on East 68th Street in Manhattan. The donor records of the Clinton Foundation, the Bush Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment, the Ford Foundation, and every other major American philanthropic institution are public documents filed with the Internal Revenue Service. Anyone can read them. The pattern is in the dates and the names. The dates and the names have not changed in 250 years. The founders saw it coming. They wrote it down. They died on the same day, on the date the country was born, having said what they had to say. The country is 250 years old. The same families are still in the White House. The aristocracy America fought a revolution to escape did not arrive after the founding. It was the founding. It is still the country.